Welcome to the Wealth Wisdom, where money has history and knowledge becomes power.
Most people believe financial crises are accidents, unfortunate mistakes, random shocks no one saw coming. But what if the biggest economic disasters in history weren't accidents at all? What if the world's most powerful banking institutions discovered something dark, something disturbingly profitable? Crises don't destroy their power. Crises increase their power. Because when you look closely, behind every collapse, every panic, every trillion-dollar disaster, you see the same pattern repeat. The same elite groups survive. The same institutions grow stronger. And the same central banking networks tighten their grip. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a century and a half of hidden financial engineering and exposing the uncomfortable truth. The most effective method the banking cartels have ever used to consolidate power isn't stability, it's crisis. And they've been running this playbook almost flawlessly for more than 150 years. This is the story your textbooks skipped, a story with familiar names, but unfamiliar motives, a story that quietly shaped the world you live in, your savings, your economy, your future. This is how banking cartels consolidated power through crisis manufacturing. Part 1. Origins. The birth of the crisis engine, the industrial age. A convenient chaos travel back to the late 1800s. The world is industrializing at lightning speed. Factories boom. Railroads spread. Cities expand. But there's a shadow behind the progress. Banks collapse. Currencies fail. Panic after panic sweeps across the US and Europe like a seasonal flu. And yet, after each economic disaster, something peculiar happens. A small number of powerful banking families emerge richer than before. People start whispering, why is it that every boom ends in a bust, and every bust ends with the banks owning more? Because the sequence was always the same. Banks expand, credit gives, the economy heats up, gives, then banks abruptly tighten, gives, markets crash. Gives, assets get sold for pennies. Railroads, factories, farmland, entire companies, all scooped up at bargain basement prices. J.P. Morgan, the first master of the game. No one played this game better than John Pierpont Morgan, the man so powerful he bailed out the U.S. government in both 1895 and 1907. Newspapers called him the man who can crash the market with a whisper and save it with a single check. During the panic of 1907, as dozens of banks collapsed, Morgan stepped forward like a benevolent king. He offered liquidity, he demanded concessions, and he acquired failing banks and massive industries at fire sale prices. By the end of that one crisis, Morgan and his circle controlled America's largest insurance companies, the top railroads, multiple trust companies, huge slices of national industry. One crisis, one man, one giant leap in control. And Morgan realized something crucial, something the elites would never forget. A crisis doesn't just clean the board. A crisis lets you rewrite the board. Part 2. Rise. How a secret meeting created the central banking era. The public wanted reform. The elites wanted control. After the panic of 1907, people were furious. They demanded banking reform. They wanted transparency. They wanted protection from the boom-bust roller coaster, but the banking elite had a different vision. If they were being blamed for crises, they would simply take control of the entire monetary system. Permanently, the Jekyll Island conspiracy in November 1910. A private train left New York under absolute secrecy. On board, Senator Nelson Aldrich Henry, Davison of J.P. Morgan, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Paul Warburg of the legendary Warburg banking family. Their destination? Jekyll Island, a secluded resort in Georgia. There, hidden from the public, they drafted the blueprint for the Federal Reserve. Paul Warburg later admitted, if the public understood what we were doing, there would be outrage. And he was right. Because what they created was not simply a central bank. It was a cartel structure, a fusion of private banking power under a public name. They designed a system that gave them control over money creation, control over interest rates, control over liquidity, control over crisis management, control over the entire banking landscape. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act passed. America now had a central bank, but not one truly controlled by the government. The era of centralized crisis management had begun, and so had the era of centralized crisis manufacturing. Part 3. Breaking Point. The Great Depression power grabbed the Roaring Twenties. Easy money. Easy speculation. After World War I, the Federal Reserve flooded the economy with cheap credit, low rates, massive money creation, speculation like the world had never seen. People borrowed to buy stocks. Banks encouraged it. Everything soared. Until the Fed suddenly switched direction. 1929, the trigger. Without warning, the Fed tightened credit. Rates went up, liquidity vanished, loans dried, markets buckled. The result? The Wall Street crash, bank failures, mass unemployment, the Great Depression. Millions lost homes, businesses shut down, entire communities collapsed. But the banking elite, they bought everything, again, at pennies. By the end of the Great Depression, thousands of local banks had disappeared. A small group of megabanks reigned supreme. The Federal Reserve gained unprecedented power. And then came one of the most astonishing moves in U.S. history. 1933. Gold is confiscated. President Roosevelt forced Americans to surrender their gold and handed it to the Federal Reserve. The last constraint on centralized banking power gone. Crisis had once again rewarded the same players. Part 4. The global stage. World War II and Bretton Woods War. The ultimate debt machine. World War II required unimaginable financing. Governments borrowed, central banks expanded, national debts exploded, and once again, central banks emerged from chaos with even greater influence. 1944. Bretton Woods, a new global order. In 1944, 44 nations gathered to reshape the post-war world. But behind the curtain, central bankers shaped the rules. The outcome: the US dollar became the global reserve. All currencies pegged to the dollar. The dollar pegged to gold. The IMF and World Bank were created. This wasn't just an economic system. It was global financial architecture, controlled by the same interests that dominated crises at home. But like all systems built on control, it eventually cracked. Part 5 to 1971. The Nixon shock and the birth of unlimited money. By the early 1970s, the US had printed more dollars than it could possibly back with gold. Foreign nations demanded gold exchanges. The banking system panicked. So in 1971, President Nixon went on TV and said the words that changed money forever. The United States will suspend convertibility of the dollar into gold. In one moment, money became unbacked. Money became manipulatable. Money became a tool of control. Now central banks had unlimited printing power, unlimited rate manipulation power, unlimited crisis creation opportunities. The modern era of engineered instability had arrived. Part 6. Fallout. Crisis becomes a business model. 1980s 2000s. Deregulation. And mega banks take over with gold gone. The financial system exploded in size, and with it came a string of crises. The Latin American debt crisis, the savings and loan collapse, the 1987 crash, the dot-com bubble, and every time cheap money gives bubble, gives collapse, gives bailout, gives consolidation. It wasn't an accident. It was a method. 2008. The coup in broad daylight. The 2008 crisis wiped out 8 million homes, 20 million jobs, $19 trillion in household wealth. But the banks? They were bailed out with trillions. Executives stayed rich. Mega banks grew larger than ever. Within 2 years, the very institutions that caused the crash were posting record profits. Central banks, they became the undisputed rulers of the financial universe. Crisis had become the ultimate power tool. Part 7. The failed fixes. The system that survives by breaking after 2008. Politicians promised, this will never happen again. But everything got worse. Banks became bigger. Markets became dependent on central banks. Debt surged to historic levels. Inequality exploded. Why? Because instability creates opportunities for centralized power. If the system ever became stable, central banks would lose relevance. Chaos isn't a flaw. Chaos is the business model. Part 8. Modern parallels. Crisis engineering in real time. 2020. The pandemic windfall. Global markets crashed in March 2020. Months later, central banks printed over $20 trillion. Stock markets hit all-time highs. Billionaires gained record wealth. Small businesses collapsed. Mega corporations absorbed everything. Banks collected record fees. The Federal Reserve bought corporate bonds. Global debt crossed $300 trillion. Same pattern, same beneficiaries. The rise of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, aren't just money. They are control mechanisms. They allow total traceability, instant freezes, programmable restrictions, direct surveillance. Something no banking cartel has ever possessed until now. But remember, new controls are always introduced during crises, and crises can always be created. Part 9. The repeating pattern. Why crises always benefit the same players. Look across 150 plus years. 1873189319071 to 9197111987. 1997 to 1000 to 008 to 020. Different decades, different triggers, different excuses. But the end result is identical. The elite gets stronger, smaller institutions disappear, middle-class wealth evaporates. Central banks gain more power, governments fall deeper into debt. Crises aren't glitches. They're features, not malfunctions. Mechanisms. Mechanisms of consolidation. Mechanisms of dependence. Mechanisms of control. And as long as crises serve the same players, they will continue. 1. Financial crises are predictable because they follow the same blueprint. Every major collapse results in greater centralization. 2. Power grows fastest during chaos, not calm. Instability strengthens the institutions that already control the system. 3. The next shift will be digital, global, and instantaneous. CBDCs and algorithmic finance will make future crises faster and more dangerous than anything we've seen. Final warning: we are stepping into a new financial age, one more centralized, more surveilled, and more tightly controlled than any system in human history. The real question isn't, will another crisis happen? It's, who will control the world when the next crisis ends? Because throughout history, every crisis had one hidden purpose: to transfer power upward, quietly, permanently, without accountability. If you want to understand the forces shaping your economy, your freedom, and your future, subscribe, hit the bell, and watch the next episode. Because once you finally see how the system works, you'll never look at money or crises the same way again.